Welcome to Million Podcasts, the show where we help podcasters, marketers, and advertisers make smarter decisions with practical, data-backed insights from the podcast industry. In today's episode, we're talking about the podcast advertising metrics that matter more than downloads. What if I told you that one of the most important numbers in podcast advertising isn't your download count? Too many advertisers judge campaigns by downloads alone, but downloads don't tell you who actually heard your ad, who took action, or whether your campaign was actually profitable. Today, we'll break down the metrics that advertisers should track before, during, and after a campaign. From completion rates and adjusted CPM to attribution, CPA, brand lift, lifetime value, and the KPIs that separate successful campaigns from expensive mistakes. So whether you're buying podcast ads, selling sponsorships, or simply want to understand how podcast campaigns are really measured, this episode will give you a practical framework for making better decisions with your data. Let's get started. Let's start with the metric almost everyone looks at first: downloads. On the surface, download numbers seem like the obvious way to judge a podcast campaign. Bigger downloads should mean better results, right? Not necessarily. A podcast download simply means an episode file was requested from a server. That request might come from someone actively pressing play, but it can also happen automatically when a listener's device syncs subscribed shows in the background. Even IAB certified download numbers, while they filter out bots and duplicate requests, still measure compliant file requests, not verified human listens. That's an important distinction. If a portion of those downloads never turns into actual listening, then the audience you're paying to reach is smaller than the audience reported on the rate card. Suddenly, the campaign looks very different. So here's the takeaway. Don't treat downloads as the final answer. Treat them as the maximum possible audience. Every metric we cover next helps you move closer to the number that really matters, the people who actually heard your message. Now let's move to a metric that tells you far more than downloads ever can. Episode completion rate. Completion rate measures the percentage of listeners who make it through most of an episode, usually around the 80% mark. Why does that matter? Because someone who stays with a 45-minute episode for 36 minutes isn't casually scrolling through content. They've chosen to give that show their attention, and if your ad appears in the middle of the episode, there's a very good chance they actually heard it. That's why completion rate is one of the strongest indicators of engagement. Industry data also supports this. Host read ads in high completion podcasts consistently generate stronger purchase intent than scripted ads because listeners stay engaged for longer and trust the host delivering the message. As a general benchmark, a completion rate above 70% is excellent and means most listeners are reaching your mid-roll ad. Between 50% and 65% is still reasonable for awareness campaigns, but once completion drops below 50%, a large part of the audience is leaving before your ad even plays. So before you sponsor a podcast, don't just ask how many downloads it gets. Ask for its episode completion rate. If the creator can't provide that number from their hosting platform, that's a conversation worth having before you spend your budget. Now that you know the completion rate, it's time to rethink another number almost everyone relies on: CPM. The CPM on a podcast's rate card isn't necessarily what you're actually paying. Why? Because that published CPM assumes every reported download delivers your ad to a listener. In reality, only the listeners who stay through your ad should count. That's where adjusted CPM comes in. The formula is simple. Adjusted CPM equals published CPM divided by completion rate, multiplied by 100. Here's an example. Imagine a podcast charges a $30 CPM and has a 70% completion rate. Your actual cost becomes roughly $43 per thousand engaged listeners. Now take another show charging the same $30 CPM, but with only a 40% completion rate. Your real cost jumps to $75 per thousand listeners who actually stayed long enough to hear your ad. Suddenly, that cheaper-looking sponsorship doesn't look so cheap. This also changes how you compare podcasts. A niche show charging a higher CPM with excellent completion can deliver far better value than a larger show with a lower CPM but poor listener retention. So, whenever you're evaluating sponsorship opportunities, don't stop at the published CPM. Ask for the completion rate, calculate the adjusted CPM, and compare podcasts using both numbers. That's the difference between buying impressions and buying attention. The next metric is probably the most important one in this entire guide: cost per acquisition, or CPA. CPM tells you what you paid to reach people. CPA tells you what you paid to gain a customer. And only one of those tells you whether the campaign actually made money. Before you even look at a podcast rate card, you should already know your CPA ceiling. That's the maximum amount you're willing to spend to acquire one customer while still remaining profitable. The key point is this: your CPA ceiling comes from your business, not the podcast. Let's use an example. Suppose your product sells for $250 and after costs, your gross margin is 55%. That means you keep $137.50 from every sale. If you decide your maximum CPA is $60, you're still generating more than a 2 times return on every customer you acquire. Now you have a benchmark. Instead of asking, "Is this sponsorship expensive?" you ask, "Can this podcast realistically deliver customers for $60 or less?" To estimate that before buying, start with the engaged audience. Take the show's downloads and multiply them by its completion rate. If a podcast gets 10,000 downloads with a 70% completion rate, that's about 7,000 engaged listeners. Using a conservative conversion estimate of 0.5% to 1%, you can project how many customers the campaign might generate and work backwards to determine the maximum budget that still fits your CPA target. That's a far better negotiation strategy than simply reacting to whatever price appears on the rate card. So before you contact any podcast, calculate your CPA ceiling first. Once you know that number, every sponsorship opportunity becomes much easier to evaluate. Before you spend a single dollar, there's one more thing you need to do. Define what success actually looks like. This sounds obvious, but it's one of the biggest mistakes advertisers make. A campaign launches without clear success metrics. The results come back a month later, and suddenly everyone starts interpreting the numbers differently. One person focuses on downloads, another points to website traffic. Someone else talks about brand awareness. Without predefined KPIs, every result becomes open to interpretation. Instead, create a scorecard before the campaign begins. Your scorecard should include the metrics you're tracking, the target you expect to hit, how you'll measure each one, and the time frame you'll evaluate it over. For example, you might set a completion rate target above 70%, establish your maximum CPA, define an expected promo code conversion rate, measure brand recall after the campaign, make sure multiple attribution methods are in place before launch, and decide exactly what results would justify renewing the sponsorship. The important part isn't the specific numbers, it's agreeing on them before the campaign starts. That way, when the results come in, you're comparing them against a plan instead of creating new goals after the fact. We've included the complete KPI scorecard in the blog, so if you'd like to use it for your own campaigns, check the link in the description. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest reasons podcast campaigns get misjudged: attribution. According to a 2026 survey of marketing managers, attribution remains the biggest challenge in podcast advertising. And the problem usually isn't the technology, it's the timing. Most advertisers think about attribution after the campaign has started. By then, it's already too late. Podcast advertising doesn't work like display ads where someone clicks immediately after seeing a banner. A listener might hear your ad during their morning commute, remember your brand 3 days later, search for you directly, and make a purchase on another device. If you didn't prepare your tracking before the campaign launched, you'll probably never connect that sale to the podcast. That's why you should have multiple attribution methods ready before episode 1 goes live. The first is unique promo codes. These tell you exactly which podcast generated a purchase, but many listeners forget to use them, so they almost always undercount total conversions. The second is vanity URLs, which give each show its own landing page and help measure traffic coming directly from the episode. The third is pixel-based attribution. Tools like Podscribe and Claritas connect listener data with conversions, helping identify customers who never clicked a link or entered a promo code. And finally, there's the simplest method of all, post-purchase surveys. Just asking customers where they heard about you often uncovers conversions every other tracking method missed. No single attribution method is perfect. The strongest campaigns combine all four, giving you a much more accurate picture of what's actually driving results. We've compared all four attribution methods side by side in the blog, so if you want to see the complete breakdown, check the link in the description. Here's another mistake that makes good podcast campaigns look like failures: using an attribution window that's too short. Podcast listeners rarely hear an ad and buy immediately. Someone might listen on Monday, think about the product for a few days, search for the brand later in the week, and finally make a purchase the following weekend. If your attribution window ends after 7 days, that conversion simply disappears from your reports. The campaign didn't fail. Your measurement did. According to Podscribe's Q4 2025 Performance Benchmark Report, host-read podcast ads are measured using a 30-day attribution window. Shortening that window significantly reduces the number of recorded conversions, even though the campaign itself hasn't changed. Podcast conversions also tend to arrive in waves. The first wave comes shortly after a new episode is released, but another wave often appears weeks later, as listeners discover older episodes and hear your ad long after publication. Those conversions are just as valuable, yet a 7-day window ignores them completely. The takeaway is simple. If you're evaluating podcast advertising, give your campaigns enough time to work. For most brands, a 30-day attribution window is the minimum, while 60 days provides an even clearer picture for higher consideration purchases. Otherwise, you risk turning a profitable campaign into one that only looks unsuccessful on paper. Now let's look at a decision every advertiser has to make before building a media plan. Should you prioritize reach or frequency? Reach is the number of different people who hear your ad. Frequency is how many times the same person hears it. With a fixed budget, you can't maximize both. If you advertise across lots of different shows, you'll reach more unique listeners, but each person may only hear your message once. If you concentrate your budget on fewer shows, fewer people hear the ad, but the right audience hears it repeatedly. Which approach is better depends entirely on your goal. If your objective is direct response, driving signups, purchases, or leads, frequency usually wins. Someone who hears your host-read ad 3 or 4 times on a trusted podcast is far more likely to remember it and take action than someone who heard it only once. Research from Cumulus Media's 2025 Audioscape study found that purchase rates increased significantly between the first and third exposure to a podcast ad, while additional exposures delivered much smaller gains. On the other hand, if your goal is brand awareness, reach becomes more important. Instead of repeating your message on one show, you spread your budget across several podcasts with similar audiences, introducing your brand to as many qualified listeners as possible. The mistake many advertisers make is mixing these strategies. They expect direct response results from an awareness campaign, or they buy repeated placements when their real goal was simply getting in front of more people. Before you spend $1, decide what success looks like. If it's conversions, lean toward frequency. If it's awareness, lean toward reach. That one decision shapes the rest of your media plan. Not every podcast campaign is designed to generate an immediate sale. Sometimes the goal is much simpler. You want more people to know your brand, remember your product, or think differently about your company. In those campaigns, there's no promo code to track and no link that tells the whole story. Instead, you measure brand lift. Brand lift looks at how awareness, brand recall, favorability, and purchase intent change after people hear your ads. The standard approach compares 2 groups. One group heard your podcast campaign, the other didn't. The difference between those groups shows the real impact of your advertising. According to Nielsen's podcast Ad Effectiveness Research through Q2 2025, podcast advertising delivered an average 10-point lift in brand awareness, 8-point lift in information-seeking behavior, and 6-point lift in purchase intent. Even more impressive, unaided brand recall reached around 70% among listeners who heard podcast ads. Sounds Profitable's 2025 Trust and Attention Report also found podcast advertising produced an 86% ad recall rate, outperforming social media, YouTube, and traditional broadcast media. Those numbers explain why so many brands continue investing in podcast advertising, even when there isn't an immediate sale to measure. But remember, brand lift only works if you plan for it before the campaign begins. You can't decide halfway through that awareness was your goal and expect meaningful data. If you're running an awareness campaign, make brand lift your primary KPI from day one and work with a measurement partner before launch. We've also included all of these benchmark figures and studies in the blog, so if you'd like to explore them in more detail, check the link in the description. Benchmarks are useful, but they're not targets. Think of them as filters that help you evaluate whether a podcast is worth your budget. For example, an episode completion rate above 75% signals excellent engagement and is ideal for direct response campaigns. Between 65 and 75% is strong for most goals, while below 50% is usually a sign to investigate further before buying. The same applies to host-read conversion rates. The industry median sits around 0.021% per impression. Strong campaigns reach 0.05 to 0.1%, and exceptional niche campaigns can go even higher. Acast's 2026 data also found podcast ads generated an average 1.32% website conversion rate, outperforming the average click-through rates of Facebook and Instagram ads. For the latest CPM benchmarks by show size, genre, and ad format, check the dedicated guide linked in the description. The key takeaway is simple. Don't chase benchmark numbers. Use them to spot overpriced inventory, compare shows more intelligently, and negotiate with confidence. Don't judge a podcast campaign too early. The first couple of weeks rarely tell the full story. By 30 days, you're looking for early signals. Are promo codes being used? Is branded search increasing? Are customers mentioning the podcast in post-purchase surveys? These tell you the campaign is gaining traction. By 60 days, it's time to make a decision. Calculate your final CPA and compare it with the target you set before launch. If it's close to your goal, renew. If it's slightly above, test new creative or a stronger offer. If it's well above your target even after a full attribution window, it's time to move the budget elsewhere. We also break down the 3 campaign patterns to watch for: rising, flat, and declining performance, along with a simple decision framework in the blog. Check the link in the description for the complete table. Finally, don't stop measuring after CPA. Look at customer lifetime value because that's where podcast advertising often separates itself from other channels. Podcast listeners usually convert after building trust over time, which often leads to higher repeat purchases and greater long-term value. That means a campaign with a higher CPA can still deliver better overall returns if those customers spend significantly more over the following months. Before deciding whether a campaign was successful, compare the 90-day lifetime value of podcast-attributed customers with customers acquired through your other channels. The brands getting the strongest results from podcast advertising aren't necessarily spending the most, they're measuring the right metrics in the right order. If you want the complete measurement framework, including all the formulas and examples we've covered today, you'll find the full guide linked in the description. Let's wrap up with a few of the most common questions advertisers ask about podcast metrics. The first question is, what are podcast advertising metrics? Podcast advertising metrics are the measurements that tell you whether a campaign is actually working. The most important ones include episode completion rate, adjusted CPM, cost per acquisition, attribution coverage, and customer lifetime value. Downloads are useful, but they only measure file requests, not verified listens. The next question is, what is a good episode completion rate? A completion rate above 70% is considered strong for direct response campaigns because most listeners stay long enough to hear your mid-roll ad. Between 50% and 65% is generally acceptable for awareness campaigns, while anything below 50% deserves a closer look. Another common question is, how do you calculate adjusted CPM? Take the published CPM, divide it by the show's completion rate, then multiply by 100. That gives you the real cost per 1,000 engaged listeners instead of the headline number on the rate card. The next question is, how long should your attribution window be? Plan for a 30 to 60-day attribution window before the campaign starts. Podcast listeners often take days or even weeks to convert, so a 7-day window usually underestimates performance. And finally, which attribution methods work best? The strongest setup combines 4 methods: unique promo codes, vanity URLs, pixel-based attribution, and post-purchase surveys. Using multiple attribution methods gives you a much more complete picture than relying on promo codes alone. And that's a wrap for today's episode. If you want the complete formulas, benchmark tables, and frameworks we covered, check out the full blog linked in the description. If you found this episode helpful, follow Million Podcasts for more practical guides on podcast advertising, sponsorships, and podcast growth. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.